Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. I'm really excited today because this is such an interesting story. So we've got with us today Marc Goldberg, who's a historian, writer and ex-Israeli Defence Force. His most recent book is called Beyond the Green Line, a British volunteer in the Israeli Defence Force during the I'm going to say this wrong, Mark, you've got to help me out here.
Al-Aqsa
Intifada, thank you. We're not going to be talking about that today, though, because we're going to be talking about one very specific man. We're going to be talking about Teddy Kolleck. Hi, Mark.
Hi. Great to be here.
I'm so excited to talk about this guy. He's had such an interesting, would you call it a career?
He is the Jewish James Bond.
He's just, some of the stuff he's done is just absolutely awesome. Right, okay, enough of us chatting, because we spent about 30 minutes before you started recording this podcast chatting. You just told us who he was, the Israeli James Bond, but do we know anything about his early life?
Yeah, we know that originally he's from, he was born in Hungary and grew up in Vienna, to kind of a middle, maybe upper middle class Jewish family, you might say. His dad was a banker for the Rothschild Bank, which wasn't something that appealed to Kolleck. He was actually named Teddy. His parents gave him the name Theodore, after Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism. So they were a Zionist family. But he was never known as Theodore. He was always known as Teddy. But he took to Zionism from an early age, and basically had no interest in school, but a lot of interest in kind of Zionism and his Zionist youth movement, which was called Blue and White. So his early life, apparently, according to his biographer, was all about kind of bunking off school, doing things for the youth movement, and then making his way to Mandate Palestine to live as early as he could. So he got there in his, I think, early 20s.
Sounds like a cheeky chap who just didn't want to go to school, really. Yeah,
he got quite well known. His reputation was, throughout his life, was that he was known quite well as a drinker, or to use the Yiddish word schmoozer, someone who can just get on with other people, make them like him, and then convince them to do things for him. And that served him well. And, you know, as he grew up, he was kind of working in the intelligence service of the Jewish agency, and then one of the founder members of the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Service, the Mossad. And he's quite well known for some of their Mossad's earliest successes.
You've got to be that kind of agent. I think you've got to have some sort of charm behind you.
He just comes across as very suave in everything that he does, and in every kind of anecdote that you read about him. It's always kind of him talking somebody else into doing something, or succeeding in getting information out of someone over cognac in some kind of club, jazz bar somewhere. He was very active in Istanbul during World War II. And there's a lot of anecdotes about him that come from there as well.
We're going to get to that stage. We will get to that stage. So before we start on the Second World War, because that breaks out August. My gosh, October, says the World War II historian. Gosh, no idea what's happening to me today, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
So what was he actually doing in the late 1930s before that all kicked off?
So, well, what happened was that he got out of, so if you remember Hitler takes power 1933 in Germany, then there's the Anschluss later on with his native Austria. But by the time of the Anschluss, he was already in Palestine. So at that point, he was kind of founding a communal settlement in the north of Israel called En-Gev, which and then was later voted to be the Mukhtar, or the kind of village head. And that's when he started really deploying his kind of skills at making good relationships. And he made apparently very good relationships with the local Arab communities, and very good relationships with the local British forces and civil service people. So he managed to kind of bring a lot to Kibbutz En-Gev. Kind of became known as a cultural center as much as anything else. And they were some of the first people to engage in tourism and really see that as an industry, and also music. They're well known for bringing orchestras to Engev near the Kinneret, near kind of a lake near there, who would perform at this small kind of unknown settlement, mainly due to his force of personality and succeeding in bringing people over. But ultimately, the guy was kind of a servant of the cause. So he worked for the Jewish agency that was, kind of the authority in Palestine representing Jewish people. And they kind of sent him when oppression of Jewish people in Europe became more intense. So they put him to work in Europe and in Great Britain in trying to help Jewish refugees, escape from Europe. At first, they sent him to the UK, where he kind of worked on finding the logistics, effectively. Where are people who have succeeded in escaping Europe for the United Kingdom? Where are they, physically going to go? What are they going to do when they get there? How are they going to get there? And part of that was in 1938. He ended up going back to his native Vienna, where he met with Adolf Eichmann to secure 3,000 exit permits for Austrian Jews, to get out. So he actually talks about that. It's mentioned in his biography. They've written, at the end of a large hall sat a young man in an impeccably ironed uniform and conspicuous swastika. His expression was cold. He did not offer Teddy a seat, but presented a series of specific and practical questions. I saw before me, Teddy would later recall, a Nazi official, and while we all despised the Nazis, none of us could have dreamed of the atrocities that would follow. That's kind of his only recollection that I'm aware of his meeting with Adolf Eichmann. Although, of course, the Mossad in 1961 brought him to Israel for trial.
That's so incredible. He met Adolf Eichmann before the Second World War, before all of this absolute horrific shit kicks off, basically.
Yeah, it was in 1939. It was literally just before. It must have been just before it all kicked off.
Okay, so we've hit, Second World War. Where is he and what is he doing?
Right, well, he's doing a bunch of things. He's back in Palestine, really. At the very beginning of it, he's kind of in Europe, doing the activities that I discussed beforehand, but he's quickly brought back to Palestine. And the thing about Kolleck is he speaks a whole bunch of languages. He speaks German, he speaks English, he speaks Hebrew. I think he picked up Arabic even. And he's able to serve as a liaison. He's actually the perfect liaison figure between the Jewish agency and the British Army. And, the strategy of the Jewish agency at the time was kind of very succinctly put by Ben Gurion, which was, we'll fight the white paper like there is no war, and we'll fight the war like there is no white paper. So the white paper refers to the amount of Jews who were allowed to immigrate to Palestine, which was very few during World War II. But fighting the war ultimately took precedence because of, the extent to which the Jews were being persecuted by the Nazis, and the visceral hatred that all of the Jews really felt towards Hitler and wanted to get involved in fighting that war. So Teddy Kolleck's job was to engage with the British and give them whatever they wanted. And mainly what they wanted was a specific kind of manpower that they could use to fight the Germans with. And what the Jews could provide was a whole plethora of European native German speakers or native Polish speakers, basically people who understood both Germany and the occupied countries of Europe very, very well, and who could be trained as soldiers and parachuted back in to occupied Europe to work as agents for the British. And Kolleck performed that function with some skill.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so his real liaison was with the Special Operations Executive.
Wow.
He worked with them. Yeah, so he worked with them a lot to provide them with the manpower that they needed in order to kind of do these kinds of spying / sabotage roles.
Question: do you know if he worked with women as well?
Sure, he worked with women. Yeah, absolutely.
That would have been. I wonder if he ever worked with Krystyna Skarbek then, because she's my favourite SOE agent, being Polish, beautiful, and incredibly clever.
Where was her area of operations? Was she kind of trained in the UK and then sent in that way?
Yes.
So it's unlikely that he would have worked with her because he was doing this from the Middle East.
I think she ended up in the Middle East at one stage, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it's not surprising, I suppose, because the Middle East became a bit of a hub for their espionage aspect. It was quite far behind the lines of the actual war. But I mean, if you think of occupied Europe and follow kind of the limits, the very borders of the Axis-controlled territory, you basically hit Turkey. And Istanbul became kind of that gateway city, which was not under Axis control, but right next to Axis-controlled territory. So it was important for everyone who was basically fighting this war to have some kind of presence there.
So then that brings us to 1942 and 43. Where does the Jewish agency send him then?
So the Jewish agency send Kolleck to Istanbul. At this point, they're starting to receive kind of these vague reports about the Holocaust as it's unfolding. And Kolleck kind of becomes the Jewish agency's man in Istanbul to understand more about what's happening in occupied Europe to the Jews. And while Kolleck is there, because of his connections, he effectively, you could argue that he serves the purpose that the Jewish agency has sent him there by providing services to the British and Americans so that he can kind of leverage that in order to find out more. Or you could argue that he also engaged in fighting the war, really, for the side of the Allies, in addition to gaining information. But that's what he does while he's there. He kind of debriefs people who were managing to get out of Europe. He debriefs them on how they escaped, on what the conditions were like there for Jews. But a lot of people he also turned around and sent back in again. He turned people into couriers. He bribed members of Axis diplomatic corps to take messages back into occupied Europe for him, and to effectively kind of be delivery agents for him. So he would end up working with the OSS, and he would working with SIS to share the knowledge that he was getting on Allied bombing, for example, on the effectiveness of it in Romania, to find out what was happening with downed Allied air crews, and which areas might have partisans in that would be helpful to them, so that if they needed to bail out, and they could plot a course for maybe 10 more minutes, are there areas that are better to bail out in than other areas?
I can't get out of my mind that moment where you said that he managed to bribe people from the Axis to go back and be couriers. I mean, could you imagine the amount of persuasive power you have to be able to convince someone to work against something that they believe in? Unless he obviously picked the ones that were weak and not weak, but agreed more with or disagreed more with what the government was doing.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, really. I was amazed when I read about it myself, because it's just not a part of the historiography that you ever hear about. I'll read you a passage actually from his biography, which was given to the biographer in an interview that she conducted with somebody who worked with Kolleck in Istanbul. Who were the couriers then? They were diplomats. People from the underworld didn't travel during the war. The couriers were from Romanian, Hungarian and Czech foreign offices, and we can assume there were those working for both sides. They were very cautious, were not among the righteous of the world. They asked for large amounts of money and were not willing to take too many chances. One had to find the first connection, decide who would speak with whom, and check their connection with those who sent them. At this, Teddy excelled. So it's part of this very kind of intelligence work, is cross-checking the information that you're getting, and to make sure that it's kind of valuable, that it's true, really. And when you're dealing with people who they want the money, but they don't really want to do much else, it's imperative to make sure that the information you're getting is correct.
So did he do anything else in Istanbul at the time?
Well, one thing that he did manage to do was that he actually convinced the American OSS representative to send Jewish agency transmissions on his behalf back to Palestine so the British couldn't intercept them, which I found like a really interesting success on his part. I mean, how do you convince someone to do that? But I mean, he managed it.
You did say he was suave. He was a suave man.
Yeah, he's a suave guy. And actually, when I started looking at him when I wrote an article for Tablet magazine, and they've used an image of him in a tuxedo for the article, which I just thought worked perfectly. And presents this image of this guy who's this kind of, well, who is he? He's not even, is he a secret agent? Well, for what country? There's no country. He doesn't represent anyone. And yet he has his fingers in a whole range of different pies, and he's accessing information that other people can't get hold of and that is useful for the Allied war effort. So it's really impressive stuff.
I'm actually Googling that photo right now.
Great picture, isn't it?
Bear with me 2 seconds. It is just coming up. Oh, wow. Okay. Very handsome gentleman.
I'll read you a little bit more from his biography. In April 1943, while Teddy was in Istanbul, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began, and Teddy transmitted information about it to the British and the Jewish Agency. And this, by the way, is also part of his job, is to one, he's getting information about this Holocaust that's unfolding, is to make sure that the Allied powers are aware of it, that they need to know, that they need to understand that this is happening, in order that perhaps they can do something about it. So he transmitted information about it to the British and to the Jewish Agency. On April the 19th, when the uprising began, there were still some 60,000 Jews in the ghetto. It was an act of resistance. Now, Teddy wrote the following. On the 15th and 16th of May, 3 German soldiers were sent to the ghetto with an order to deport 800 workers to an unknown destination. When the 3 did not return, a division was deployed to find them, which also failed to return. At this point, another group of Germans tried to enter the ghetto and was met with heavy gunfire. A few hundred German deserters took cover within the walls of the ghetto, and together with the Jews and a number of Polish partisans, continued to fight. These details were told to our source by a German customs official who arrived in Budapest on May 21st, 1943. It's the second time that organised attempts at self-defence have been reported to us. Since the first report in April, many of those whom we knew personally had been killed.
I find that really interesting because people obviously claim that Poles and Polish partisans didn't help. But there you go, ladies and gentlemen, it has just been laid out for you.
No, I mean, how do you think that they got their guns? How do you think they got their supplies?
It was, I know this isn't the topic that we're supposed to be talking about it, but it was such an amazing act of resistance for what the Jews were doing in that ghetto. I mean, they knew they had no way out, but they're going to go out with a bang.
I heard it was the first act of mass resistance to the Nazis in occupied Europe in World War II.
Probably. I would not have been surprised. Because Warsaw is a city of 2 uprisings, and people seem to forget that.
Yeah.
Warsaw defied the Nazi regime, and they hated it for it.
Yeah. They did, and the Russian army sat back while the Germans razed it to the ground.
Yeah, and there was quite a few Jewish fighters that took part in that. They were released from Gilshufka prison, and some of them were hiding, obviously being hidden by other Poles. They joined in, and actually, I know people don't like the film so much because of Roman Polanski, but that film actually shows a lot of what happened in Warsaw at the time. And I think that's such a very well-made film.
Yeah.
So anyway, moving away from coming off topic as we usually do on this podcast. So what he's doing right now is absolutely remarkable. He is trying to basically make sure that the Allies are fully aware of what is happening. So ladies and gentlemen, the Allies were aware of what was happening in the Holocaust.
Yeah, they were.
They were very aware. So, okay, so now let's hit 1944 because we're now coming very slowly towards the end of the war.
What's happening as it becomes clearer and clearer that the war is coming to an end, that Hitler is about to be defeated. So the internal tensions among the different armed Jewish groups in Palestine start getting more and more coming to the boil. They have massive ideological divisions between them, and they very much differed in their approach and in their radicalism. The main group, which was Kolleck's kind of faction, was Haganah, it means defense, and it was what became the IDF. Effectively, it was kind of the national movement, which he worked for. However, a splinter group, it had been maybe splintered away from about 20 years before. It was called the Irgun. A man who would become Prime Minister of Israel much later, Menachem Begin, was in charge of the Irgun towards the end of World War II. And they started getting very antsy. They also knew that the Holocaust was happening, and they knew about restrictions to Jewish immigration to mandate Palestine. And it was driving them mad. And they were, and by the time we get to 1944, another Jewish dissident organization, the smallest of the three, called Lehi, or the Stern Gang, really they started killing people. They declared open season on the British. And what they did, which was kind of perceived to be catastrophic by Kolleck's group, the Haganah, was that they assassinated Lord Moyne, British minister in the Middle East, and a friend of Churchill's. And when they did that, they effectively jeopardized British support for Zionism. So Churchill, who always been a great friend to Zionism, kind of distanced himself a great deal, made a very critical speech in the House of Commons about it. And this really kind of put the Jewish agency on notice that they needed to clean house. And one of the things that they did was bring Kolleck back to Palestine to help them deal with it. And he was involved with using his connections with the British to pass information about the Jewish dissident organizations onto them, to get them arrested, to get them apprehended, and to kind of say, look, these guys are a faction within us. They don't represent us. And we'll prove it to you by handing information over to you about them. But that was only part of what happened. The other part of what happened was this very kind of internal attempt, largely kind of successful, to bring the dissidents under control of the larger Jewish movement without even involving the British. So, it involved Haganah guys going out, often kidnapping members of the Irgun Lehi, beating them up, interrogating them severely, even holding them in their own kind of facilities for a while, and then letting them go. It was known as the season, like the hunting season, when they really went after the dissidents, because they were petrified that it was going to bring down the whole of the British army on their heads and ruin everything that they were fighting for.
There is also a civil war between these organisations, isn't there?
Well, this is basically the civil war. Civil war never actually breaks out in a formal sense between the Jewish groups. But there's a civil war about to break out, kind of always under the surface. There are these tensions between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, which eventually kind of breaks out into full-scale war when the British withdraw. And that was a bit later. That's in 1948.
What does Kolleck do though during this whole mess?
Well, he's sent off to Britain once the war finishes. And by the way, the end of the war only exacerbates the internal tensions between the Jewish groups. But there's an understanding that Kolleck is kind of this consummate diplomat type character. And he's also really good at finding out information. So they send him to London, which is the capital, of the British Empire, where all of the opinion formers are, where all of the decision makers are, to try and kind of maintain some kind of relationship with the British. And they send him together with Abba Eban, a man who would become the foreign minister. And also, in his career, he'd end up being the Israeli foreign minister, but he was also the ambassador to the UN and the ambassador to the USA at the same time for Israel. So he was another consummate diplomat who spoke several languages, but he had no involvement really in intelligence matters. That was much more Kolleck. So they send them both over there at the same time to try and kind of repair the wounds that are being made in the relationship between the Jewish agency and the British. And, you know, it's if anything, it's partially successful, if it's successful at all. But ultimately the tensions are spilling over once the war is finished so much that it's almost impossible to patch them up, I think.
So after London, he's sent somewhere else, isn't he? You go to the US.
So so he's in London in kind of the winter of 45, beginning of 46. Then they end up sending him to New York. Now, all of the focus of kind of diplomatic activity at this time is physically moving from London to New York. You know, the United Kingdom is bankrupt. The empire is finished. It's kind of obvious to everyone that the future of Palestine is going to be determined by the UN in New York, not in London. And Kolleck kind of, his physical movement represents that shift, the understanding that, you know, the big decisions are going to be made in the USA now. So now we need friends in the USA. And we need Kolleck over there. And Kolleck's there for a couple of years at that point. I don't think he comes back to Palestine until somewhere around 1949. And he's there the whole time when the British withdraw completely from Palestine, where it sinks into a war, and the Israelis have their war of independence. And Kolleck's job becomes much more about financing that, you know, raising money to fight that war, and then finding a way to acquire arms and getting them to the nascent state of Israel, which is a role that's basically profoundly suited to a man of his talents, or a man of his talents is profoundly suited to that role, I think I should say. And there are so many little quirky little stories about what happened during that time that are really interesting. For example, Kolleck says in his memoirs that he had set up base in a club called the Copacabana in Manhattan, which was frequented by all the famous people of the time, one of whom being Frank Sinatra. And now, because there was an arms embargo on anything going from into Palestine during the Civil War, during the kind of War of Independence, the FBI are watching Kolleck. So he ends up sending Frank Sinatra to make a payoff for him with $1 million. So Frank Sinatra eludes the FBI on behalf of Teddy Kolleck to give up a whole bunch of money that Kolleck had managed to raise there. It was one of the more colourful stories, I thought.
I love how Frank Sinatra gets involved in all of this. He gets involved in everything, doesn't he?
It goes on. I mean, his relationship with the United States actually continues, and Kolleck is one of the prime movers and shakers in convincing the nascent state of Israel that, you know, our future is best in the direction of the West, and that we should really be doing everything that we can to make friends with the United States. So that really is down to him.
Let's move forward a little bit in time, because as our followers and listeners know very well, I absolutely hate communism. You mentioned something before when we had our conversation before the recording, something to do with Khrushchev's speech in 1956. So for those who don't know, Khrushchev made a speech in 1956 denouncing Stalin.
Yeah. So Khrushchev's made this speech where he's really shocked a lot of people in the USSR, a lot of high-ranking people who heard it, and then a lot of people. It was the responsibility of a lot of party functionaries to go around the USSR repeating this speech and making sure that people hear it. So they're really denouncing Stalin. And rumours of this were getting out. I researched around it a little bit, but no one had a copy of the speech. That is until it was the Mossad who provided the CIA with the text of the document. And this really was kind of the event that put Israeli intelligence on the map for Western intelligence services and made them think, okay, so this country is able to do stuff and it's worth having, at the very least, that kind of intelligence to intelligence service relationship. Yeah. So if I read a bit about this from the biography, the most significant achievement that resulted from Israeli-American cooperation in the area of intelligence was the famous speech given secretly by Khrushchev on February 23rd, 1956, at the 20th Convention of the Communist Party. In April, 6 weeks after the convention, the complete text of the speech reached Jim Angleton's desk after first passing through the hands of Amos Menor in Tel Aviv. Menor himself at first suspected that the speech was a forgery aimed at planting disinformation in the West. However, after consulting with experts and translators, he was convinced of its authenticity. He left his home with great excitement, en route to Ben-Gurion's home to deliver the document. So it was Kolleck who had the connections in the CIA to know where they could pass it on to. And his main connection in the CIA really was a guy called Jim Angleton. And Jim Angleton, and he was kind of one of the pillars, one of the founders of the Central Intelligence Agency, with a responsibility for counterintelligence. A notoriously difficult guy to get on with and make friends with. Teddy Kolleck succeeded in charming him and kind of building that relationship, which really served, I think, as the bedrock of the relationship that still exists today.
He also had a relationship with Kim Philby, you mentioned before, didn't he?
Yeah, right. So this relationship is very interesting because it goes all the way back. But the way that the story goes is that Kolleck was in Langley, Virginia, in the 50s with Jim Angleton, and they're walking around, and he sees Kim Philby, and he says, "What's that guy doing here?" And Angleton says, "Well, he's SIS." And Kolleck goes, "Well, once a communist, always a communist." And actually, Kolleck had known Philby since the 30s because Philby had married a Viennese woman and was friendly with certain people in Vienna who were known to be pro-Soviet and very left-wing. So he understood. So he had that kind of going all of the way back with Philby and knew that he was a spy. He warned the Americans, but there's no evidence the Americans ever acted on that.
Wow, I did not even know that.
Yeah, really interesting stuff because it goes back to kind of the Jewish circles that he came from back in his hometown, really, and it kind of leapfrogs all of the other stuff that happened. And Philby wasn't a spy when Kolleck knew him. He just knew that he was a very left-wing guy, and then was for that reason was pretty surprised to see him at the heart of the CIA.
And he basically turned around to the Americans and said, "Hey, communist, right here," and they go, "Yeah, all right." Yeah.
Although the British basically did the same thing. It's not like, the warning signs about Philby were there, but I think there was just this kind of idea that, well, no, he's our man. No, of course not.
Oh dear. So I've got a question. When does he give up this whole kind of intelligence gig?
He tries to kind of relax. He tries to go, he actually gained a place at Harvard and he had gone off there to study. And apparently he was at Harvard for one day in the very early 50s when he got a call from Ben-Gurion saying, no, I need you to come back and run my office. So he was really the first head of Ben-Gurion's office. I think that was from 52 to 62. Did that for 10 years. And this time is also kind of like, everything's a bit of a grey area. So he's still kind of involved in intelligence while running the Prime Minister's office. But he's persuaded to run for mayor of Jerusalem.
Oh, wow.
At first he's not so interested, but his son famously said to him, why do you want to do that? You'll be responsible for the garbage.
Really?
Yeah. It's like, you'll be responsible for municipal services. This is a guy who's just gone from agent handling and meeting heads of state to this much more municipal role. So I do understand the sentiment. But yeah, he decides to go for it. And he goes for it, interesting, he goes for it as an independent. He doesn't actually run on any party's ticket. He runs on his own ticket and ends up doing the job for 28 years.
Wow. 28 years he's the mayor of Jerusalem.
Yeah, 28 years, and it's kind of a really interesting time as well, because he becomes mayor while half of Jerusalem is controlled by Jordan. And just a couple of years after he takes over as mayor, suddenly Israel has responsibility for the whole city. And the way that he responds to that is very interesting, and reportedly very enlightened as well. He tries to really bridge the gap between Jewish West and Arab East Jerusalem. I'm not sure exactly how much success he had with that, but he certainly tried. He certainly reached out.
He sounds like a remarkable guy, really.
Yeah, he does. A really remarkable character, and he's quite peripheral to the historiography. Like, I'd never really heard of him until his name popped out to me. I was doing research on Abba Eban in the UK National Archives, and his name kind of popped out. So I decided to download all of the declassified MI5 files on him, and just kind of got a glimpse into this figure who's so larger than life, and who has done. The more that you look at him, the more questions there really are about how did he do all these things, and where did he get it from? Who trained this guy to be an agent handler? Where did he never officially worked or was trained by anyone? And yet there he is at the center of everything.
So what kind of legacy do you think he leaves behind?
That's a really good question. What's interesting about Israel and the way that Israel has developed is the Kolleck was very much part of a clique which ruled Israel for kind of the first, 30, 40 years of its existence. Now, kind of in the Benjamin Netanyahu era, all of the people who come from the tradition that Kolleck was against, so all of the people who come from the tradition of the Irgun are running the country and are kind of on the political ascendancy. The kibbutz movement itself is kind of finished. So it's difficult to see what it is that Kolleck leaves behind, but I think that you can still see him in the spirit of openness, if you like, in Israel, or the desire amongst Israelis to be more cosmopolitan, to be open to the world around them, to be Western centric. That all came from Kolleck. And, if you look at kind of the way Israel relates to America, which is basically, we need you and we need you in order to survive, and your funding, and the way that the United States treats Israel, which is effectively as its friend in the Middle East, that all really came from Teddy Kolleck. So I think that's probably his greatest legacy, is the US-Israeli relationship.
Mark, this has been so excellent. I've had so much fun talking about this incredible, remarkable man. Definitely got to come back on, because this was I loved it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, bring me back. We'll talk about World War II in the next one.
Oh, I love it. I never get enough of World War II. Amazing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/hack history, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great book.
We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes, because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.